Hi, my name is David Rotenstein. I'm a public historian and folklorist based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The title of my talk is Wires, Walls, Poles, and Matzoh, Industrial Archaeology and Jewish Cultural Landscapes. The talk derives from research I began doing about 10 years ago in the Washington, D.C. and Atlanta suburbs on eruvin, which are symbolic boundaries that Orthodox and conservative Jews use to enable them to carry things during the Jewish Sabbath. My research these days doesn't necessarily coincide with my industrial history work. I am currently working on a project involving the social history of numbers gambling in Pittsburgh. But I've written on telecommunications history, bridges, meatpacking, leather tanning, and a whole host of other IA topics over my 37-year career. This is the product of a little over 10 years of research where I've been looking at eruvin. Eruvin is the plural for eruv in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. And I've dipped in and out of the research for 10 years, and I wanted to dip back into it to deviate from my current research into organized crime history here in Pittsburgh, which has absolutely nothing to do with industrial archaeology. So the talk I'm going to give for the next 20 or so minutes derives from this informal research that I've been doing. I'm going to use a mixture of images and videos that I've shot in what I call my ride-alongs with rabbis who build and check and maintain eruvs throughout the United States. And I'm going to start off with an image that I use in some of the classes that I teach at Goucher College. The focus for our purposes this evening is infrastructure, and the slide here shows several types of infrastructure in a typical American suburb. We see transportation infrastructure, we see telecommunications infrastructure, we see electricity infrastructure, but hidden in this slide, and I guess sort of connecting to something Chris said at the end, is something that's designed to be invisible, part of the eruv infrastructure. So we can see our transportation infrastructure here, the streets, the sidewalks, the stop sign, the utility pole, the utility box, and then here's this 2x4 nailed to the utility pole. That's the invisible infrastructure that we'll be talking about for the next several minutes. I'll be sharing with you some spectacular views. This is an eruv string in Manhattan, and it's juxtaposed against a historic building. And it's really hard for folks to describe an eruv, and it's sometimes really hard for folks to get their heads around what an eruv is. So I'm gonna dip back into popular culture here and introduce you to some of the complexities of spotting an eruv in the wild, so to speak, that aired on CBS recently. So there's a small cadre of scholars in the United States and Canada and Europe who study eruvin, study the eruv from its perspective as an object in observant Jewish culture, as an element of the traditional Jewish cultural landscapes. I take an approach that sort of combines them and looks at how the eruv is a type of adaptive use. Those of us in historic preservation are familiar with types of adaptive uses, churches and mills turned into brew works, old factories converted into loft apartments. This is a different type of adaptive use in that it uses infrastructure that's still in use, still active, and it gloms onto that infrastructure a new use, a use that is completely unrelated to the distribution of electricity or to telecommunications. Throughout the United States and Canada, if you travel through community with a large Jewish population, you'll sometimes on Thursday afternoons or Friday mornings see rabbis staring up at utility poles, And there's a reason for that. The eruv is an unbroken boundary that is kosher, and the rabbis have to ensure that the eruv is intact for the coming Sabbath. So this invisible cultural landscape is part of a Jewish built environment that includes things that are familiar to folks. Synagogues are perhaps the most evident element of the built environment in a traditional Jewish community. Mikvahs, the ritual bath, is another element of the built environment. And as a historian, as an industrial archaeologist who likes to travel to places where I can see and experience the things that I research, I travel and I live in places that have eruvin. So I'm speaking to you from Pittsburgh. I'm not actually inside an eruv, but there's an eruv nearby, and you can see the infrastructure here glommed onto the utility infrastructure. A little farther shot out, and this is my home. This is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But when I travel to places like New York City, I also search out the eruvin in New York City, and you can see the Empire State Building in the background here, and the eruv string running through the foreground. MetLife Building, again, the arrows kind of highlighting the eruv string attached to the tops of light poles in this case. Halifax, Nova Scotia, again, utility pole, eruv string. So how can you, as a scholar, as someone who wants to understand the Jewish built environment and eruvin, discern these strings, these wires, these discrete elements glommed onto infrastructure in a tangle of signs and wires and poles in a place like the Virginia Highland part of Atlanta, Georgia? As the clip I played from the Equalizer suggests, it's not necessarily that easy. And as a colleague, I think she's actually on the program this evening, once wrote, it takes a lot of practice to spot these things, and only with the help from an initiate was the author of this particular paper ever able to locate the jumble inside the eruv boundary. And that's because the eruv boundary is intended to be invisible. Yet we have eruvin scattered globally at this point. In North America, I think there are a little over 200 eruvin distributed in Jewish communities. This is a map that I created in 2011 showing the active eruvin in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, covering several dozen acres, square miles, if you will, in heavily populated Jewish areas. And these are the eruvin in the city of Atlanta and the Atlanta suburbs, again, reflecting the role that these traditional cultural landscapes play in Jewish communities. Eruvs didn't appear in the United States nor in Canada until the late 19th century. They're actually a pretty old adaptation of Jews to urban and later suburban environments that date back a couple of thousand years. They first appeared in Europe in the 1860s, where German rabbis recognized that this new infrastructure could be adapted to religious use. Arabs spread out from the cities into the suburbs as suburbanization took hold in North America. So between 1894 and 1970, for example, there were only 4 eruvin built. St. Louis, Missouri had the first eruv, which was constructed in 1894. Toronto, Canada in 1921, and then 2 in Manhattan, 1 in 1905, and the second in 1962, all using various aspects of infrastructure to create an unbroken boundary. An unbroken boundary that, for all intents and purposes, isn't visible. I'm going to introduce you to a rabbi in Atlanta, Rabbi Chaim Lindenblatt, who's going to illustrate how invisible this boundary actually is.
Walk there now, that's not the eruv, right? What happens is, this is the border of the eruv right here. So if you're walking down East Rock Spring, this one is what we use. You don't need to add an additional one in here. Actually, might have not used to have it. This goes straight into that pole. So this is the eruv. If I'm here, I'm in the eruv. If I'm here, I'm out of the eruv, right?
Yeah.
Because it cuts here, goes straight into that pole, and then cuts down Rock Spring to the end. So we're now in the eruv. We can walk on this side, and we will be in the eruv. So let's just.
So the eruv creates opportunities for observant Jews to ensure that they're maintaining the Sabbath. So in Jewish Talmudic law, there are 39 rules or laws governing what can and can't be done on the Sabbath. These include pushing things, carrying things, like if this were not an eruv, this individual on his way from synagogue wouldn't be able to carry what's in his arm. These families wouldn't be able to carry their house keys, and this man wouldn't be able to push a baby carriage. The eruv really opened up Jewish communities to allow for more social mobility, to allow for people to engage in social activities, whether it's young mothers going to synagogue or families holding communal dinners after synagogue services. So a little eruv 101, since we're not in a class where we can dive deep into it. So there are three types of eruv, and we're talking about the eruv hatzarot, the courtyards. The eruv of the courtyard basically uses existing elements of the built environment and things added to the built environment to create an unbroken boundary. These eruvim are important to the most observant of the Jewish denominations, the three principal ones here in the United States, the Orthodox, which are the most observant, and the conservative, which sort of bridge Orthodoxy and Reform, the most lenient. The eruvim, as I said, adapt themselves to the built environment, as you can see on the left here with this light pole, and on the right to the natural environment, where it's essential to create this unbroken boundary, yet there's no existing infrastructure. So in this case, in Atlanta, a creative rabbi has designed an eruv where he was able to use trees and wire to create the unbroken boundary. An illustration of some early eruvim using walled cities as an example. As walled cities came down in the Middle East and in Europe, gaps began to appear, and these gaps were then filled by the utility and transportation infrastructure. An eruv is also part of a traditional ritual practice that involves communal preparation of food, in this case, depositing matzah in a synagogue's closet or safekeeping area, which is part of the eruv ritual. And it also involves renting the space from the government entity where your eruv is going to be located. It includes designing your eruv and adapting it to the space. The first eruv built in Manhattan, for example, used the 3rd Street elevated railroad as part of its boundary. You can see how trolley poles and wires are adapted here. So what is an eruv? So the eruv creates this unbroken boundary within which observant Jews can carry things, push things, and such. And eruv boundaries use walls, they use elevated structures. In places where there isn't an existing wall, or in places where they have poles and wires, the rabbis who design the eruvim have to ensure that the poles and the wires form perfectly aligned doorposts, which are the upright, and lintels, which are the horizontal parts. So the poles form the upright, the doorpost, and the wires form the lintels in these lines of unbroken doorways that form the walls of this fictive courtyard. Eruvs are designed and built and maintained usually by consulting with a small cluster of rabbis who make this a professional practice. Rabbi Yosef Beckhover is one of the leading experts in Eruv design and construction and Jewish law surrounding them. He's written several books, including this one, which actually used one of my photos of an Eruv boundary in Montgomery County, Maryland. But these rabbis consult with local rabbis to ensure that the Eruvs are designed according to rabbinical law. And we're going to go to Rabbi Chaim Lindenblatt again, who's going to explain how this consultation process works in real life.
In a minute. And the truth is, at the time, it's a whole story. I had to have an expert come down. So at the time, the weather was so bad that he just told me do a few things and get it done, and then he had to come down again, and I made some things that he said you're not really required to do, and I'll show you a place where I added metal things that later on he told me I wasn't required to do it. You're going to see it right here. Right. You also listen here. Here's the reality in the Jewish world, especially with Arab in certain areas. There's certain hierarchy. Okay, I'm a rabbi of the shul. I have to do this sometimes. I'm not saying I don't, but you want somebody who is, has a little more experience. An expert in that area, or really an expert in general in Jewish law, who will know nuances that perhaps you will not be able to pick up. Or I did study this in yeshiva, but I didn't go out and do it. So sometimes there's some practical realities that are required. So you have to decide, and they're out there.
So what he's explaining is that even though as a practicing rabbi, he isn't fully familiar with the engineering technology of constructing and maintaining an eruv. So here's a shot of Florida Public Service Commission diagram showing how a electricity distribution system works. And here's a shot from an eruv manual, in this case from Passaic Clifton, New Jersey, showing an identical structure, but this time interpreted for an eruv. So you have your utility pole, and here's your upright, which is called a lechi, and then your wire. Sometimes it's an existing system ground, sometimes it's a string or wire added, and that's your cora, your lintel, and these things create an unbroken boundary. And that unbroken boundary needs to be maintained so it's kept kosher. Sometimes the boundary gets broken. So a car hits a pole, a storm brings power lines down, and those weekly visits by the rabbi have to ensure that the eruv's intact, and if it isn't, they make repairs.
The line, right? I just I don't know what you call it. I see through this, and the line, and then leave it to see if it hits where I want.
So he's explaining how he ensures that the line remains plumb, so it's still within Jewish law. So a couple of more examples from the utility infrastructure before we move on to transportation infrastructure. Eruv managers throughout the United States create these manuals that they give to their maintainers, and they give out to the electric company. In this case, this is one from an Eruv manual that's given to the electric company in Baltimore, Maryland. Another example showing within Jewish law how, it's fit correctly beneath the cable, still okay, still kosher, still good, unacceptable, because it always has to be beneath the lintel for it to be kosher. It's a very simple technology that they use to make these adaptations to the poles. Oftentimes it's simply plastic U-channel and staples. Sometimes it's a little more sophisticated. In this case, you have on the left the plastic U-channels and staples forming the lechi on this pole. And then here you have the plastic U-channels, and then these boards connecting the pole to the sound wall on the Washington, D.C. Beltway, because the pole is too far apart from the sound wall for it to be an intact eruv boundary. Another segment of the Washington, D.C. Beltway wall where the rabbis have used these strings and wood poles to make the connection, in this case, to the sound wall, to additional poles that run a little bit through the woods, to fences, and to the utility lines that the rabbi was repairing in the previous video clip. Here we have Halifax, Nova Scotia. Again, a lechi attached to a utility pole, and then running up above it are the wires that form the eruv. Sometimes the eruv boundary is as simple as a monofilament fishing line that is attached through a hook, ensuring that it runs directly over the top of the utility pole, again, maintaining that flush attachment. Another shot from New York City showing how it's mounted above the poles. Shot from Atlanta, Georgia. This is I-85. We'll see a rabbi driving along here shortly with a string running between the poles because the power line ends. And there's your transportation infrastructure adapted. Another shot from the Washington, D.C. Beltway. There was no wall on the Beltway here, so the rabbis in this case used wood pole as an interim. So the eruv string here goes to the sound wall, and this spans Northwest Branch parallel to the bridge. An eruv can't cross a highway because according to Jewish law, it can't be a throughway or contain people moving with greater than 600,000 people. A lot of complicated rules attached to the eruv, but this just gives you an idea of the eruv spanning this gorge in the Washington, D.C. suburbs and the Beltway running next to it. And again, nature plays its role here. The rabbis creating an eruv boundary just outside of the Emory University campus with the uprights going up the trunks of the trees and the lintels spanning from tree to tree, attached using these hooks. I'm going to play a segment that is a drive along with Rabbi Ariel Asa, who explains the role that DOTs, utility companies, and others play with the eruv managers, the maintainers, and it'll give you an idea of how he actually makes some of his repairs to the eruv on the outskirts of Emory University.
So here we're heading onto the...
This is the along the 85. This is the access road of the 85. It's going to hit here, and then it's going to connect to the wall of the 85. I'm just going to see here. I don't know if you want to go down and look or not, but see that string running across? So that runs to that pole, which then connects to this wall here, and then we're going to be using this wall here.
So it runs along the sound wall then?
Exactly. Actually check the fence on a regular basis. The assumption is that just like the wall, it really stays put.
Okay.
Unless there's some construction going on or something.
Does Georgia DOT let you know when they're going to do construction or?
No.
Okay. So you just have to make sure you stay on top of things then.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is you can see it from the 85 going north. You can actually see the fence. So if they're doing something, you'll see it as you're driving along the 85. So, I mean, once a week, or once every other week, I'm driving up and I just, glance and make sure that nothing has been disturbed.
So what kind of equipment do you bring with you?
Eruv string, hooks, and most of the other things I need I can just find. Sometimes I'll bring a hammer, but sometimes I'll just use a rock for whatever I'd use it, or less I have to schlep around. If there's something bigger, I might have to come back to bring a ladder. Sometimes I'll have to bring an extended pruning shears. So it's this electric wire here that comes across, hits this pole here, and there's the medallion right on that further one back. And we're going to now run all the way along the access road.
And it's running on the poles now.
Running on the poles, going north until we get to Claremont.
So what happens when someone dials one of the phone numbers on the medallion?
It's a good question. Technically, I think electric power, Georgia Power, whatever, when they're supposed to, when they're changing a pole or something, if they notice the medallion, they're supposed to call that number. Where it goes to, I don't know. I think Dr. Tate knows, but I don't know.
Okay.
But the experience has been that 9 times out of 10, they just change the pole and they do not make the call. And then sometimes, if they've had experience setting up there, they think they know what they're doing, and sometimes they put it up right, and sometimes not. So here, from this pole here, there's no electric wire, so we have this string.
Okay.
Running. It runs down the pole on that side, and then hits the top of. Serves as the locking down, and then we start using this wall down. This wall then connects to this fence.
So you get a feel there for all of the elements that are involved in building, maintaining, checking, and living in an era of it's an incredibly complicated system that the rabbis have developed to adapt to urban life and later to suburban life. And for those of us who work in historic preservation, they're an incredible challenge because on the one hand, they're of relatively recent vintage. As I said, most appeared after 1962, yet they're part of the dynamic traditional cultural landscapes that observant Jews have, and there's something that people doing historic preservation work need to take into account when they're doing things like Section 106 surveys or historic property surveys. And they are all around us that are traditional cultural landscape elements worthy of our investigation, and I think it's a valid topic for industrial archaeologists because it raises some intriguing questions about how technology and how infrastructure relate to things that tie into industrial structures and objects like utility poles, transportation infrastructure, and the such. So with that, I will, I guess, end with that, stop sharing, and open it up to questions.